I hate when someone takes my spot. The undergrowth and soil crunched with each step as I took a deep breath and soaked in the natural beauty around me. It was a moderate 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Birds were singing and the sun was shining down as I walked along the Strawberry Creek Trail. In about a half mile, I'd go off the trail to the designated backwoods camping area. The bubbling of the stream and the whisper of wind in the branches all sounded like an old friend welcoming me home. I had always considered Great Basin to be a hidden gem. It's the least visited national park in the States. In a few hours of hiking, I had only encountered 2 other people and 1 dog. And when I started into the wilderness to camp, I knew for sure I would be alone for the whole week. Working as a high school teacher, I got my fill of people every damn week. Don't get me wrong, I love my kids, but sometimes between them, my coworkers, supervisors, and angry parents, I could just feel like receding into a shell of jaded mistrust. Coming out here and enjoying the silence and peace of nature always made me feel better. I saw the familiar bend in the trail and started my way off the side and towards Blue Ridge. It was always my favorite spot to set up camp. A beautiful, peaceful meadow right under the shadow of Wheeler Peak. It was a strenuous hike, taking at least 2 days of non-stop marching from the parking area at the trailhead. But it was perfect, and it was always there for me. No matter what had happened in the 358 days leading up to this, I knew this week would be perfect. As I crested the ridge, I looked down at the field of small, flowering bushes. It was exactly as I remembered, always even more beautiful as the setting sun painted it in beautiful red hues. That's when I saw a tent parked exactly where I planned on setting up. It looked like a small one-person tent, green canvas, with a cold fire pit in front. I felt frustrated, then sad, then frustrated at myself for these immature feelings. It's not like you own the park. You can always find a different spot. I knew that rationally I should not be upset by this. But emotionally, it felt like I had been betrayed by a family member. I sighed and trudged my way down to the field, setting down my pack at a spot about 1,000 feet away. Who knows? Maybe this could be good for you. One person with a shared interest instead of the usual crowd at work. I started making camp, trying my best to stay optimistic as I set up my tent and began to arrange a campfire. The sun had set completely by the time the fire was merrily crackling away. I ate a quick meal, just some canned soup I had brought. I'd be going fishing in the morning, but I always packed enough food just in case. I glanced over at the other tent as I chewed slowly. It was almost invisible in the waning moonlight. I hadn't seen anyone enter or exit the tent for the whole 2 hours I'd been there. And the strangest part was there was no fire or even the glow of a lantern. It must be on some all-day hike. I tried to rationalize it, but something about the old, weathered tapestry hung in a sloppy triangle shape made me uneasy. I was being ridiculous, I knew. It was probably just a leftover from being bitter about having a neighbor in the first place. It made me think about back when I got ripped from my position in the middle school since they had fired a high school English teacher. In a day, my workload and class size doubled. It was the same feeling of something familiar being changed suddenly. I chuckled at myself for being so emotionally brittle. I need to relax and stop overthinking everything. I turned my thoughts to the rest of my week's plans as I slipped into my sleeping bag, letting the gentle breeze lull me asleep. The moon was shining coldly when I woke up with a jolt. I tried to stay still, listening carefully as I heard another twig snap just a yard from my tent. I could make out a dark silhouette, the figure of a man, projected on the nylon of my shelter. He seemed to be pacing like he was looking for something he had misplaced in the night. My heart began to pound as he slowly, quietly approached. As stealthy as I could manage, with my heart bursting from my chest, I reached towards my pack, scared to death but still planning for the worst. Inside, I knew my Colt 1911 sat fully loaded, just in case. Call me paranoid, but with the amount of mountain lions out here in the basin, I always came prepared. "Hello." The voice came from the figure, which now stood in arm's reach of my tent flap. It sounded tentative, stuttering, almost nervous. Like a child going to wake his mother when he had a stomachache. I held my breath, my trembling hand gripping the cold metal of my firearm. "Are you okay?" The voice came again, definitely masculine, but it sounded more confident now. Paternal in the way it expressed almost genuine concern. I don't know what possessed me to respond. I think it was reflexive, some innate Midwestern politeness. "I'm fine, just leave me alone," I croaked, a hoarse reply barely quieter than a shout. We sat there in silence for a few more seconds, then the figure slowly walked away. He stalked off in an almost dejected manner, his head downcast. I shuddered, the interaction surreal and terrifying, but as much as I would have loved to write it off as a dream, I knew I was awake, feeling the indent left on my palm from the vice grip on my pistol. When the sun rose a few hours later, I felt no relief. I knew, deep down in my gut, the mysterious visitor was from the tent nearby. I resolved then and there to go and introduce myself. I was still trying to rationalize what had happened as perfectly normal. Maybe he was just socially awkward. Maybe he was sleepwalking. Either way, I felt dread tie a knot in my stomach even tighter with each step as I approached. The campsite was even more dilapidated than I initially thought. The tent was torn, with ragged holes in the side, and a small, black backpack lay haphazardly by the fire. Looking at the state of the charcoal, I'd estimate no one had used the fire for at least a few months. I hesitated, a few feet from the lean-to. I could see a lumpy human shape in the sleeping bag inside through the torn patches on the side. "Hello?" I called out, my voice quaking with fear. I sat in silence. Nothing budged, and it felt like even the birdsong of the waking world faded away. It was just me, and the sleeping form in front of me. His breathing seemed slow, the relaxed inhaling and exhaling rhythmic. With sudden concern for the well-being of my fellow camper, I resolved to try once more. "Hey, are you okay?" The moment the words left my lips, the figure sat up straight. His eyes stared forward, dark hair falling loosely in front of them. He was shirtless, his frame skeletal and pale. He smiled a vacant smile and began to nod slowly. I suddenly felt the way a mouse must feel right before the trap sprung and snapped its neck. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked back to my tent briskly. I had made up my mind. I was moving camp, packing everything up, and heading another half-day south. It wasn't just fear. I also knew I wouldn't be able to relax and enjoy my vacation if I was watching over my shoulder the whole time. But things would need to be significantly worse than a slightly strange, emaciated night owl for me to give up the hard-earned trip. I didn't even bother looking back at the stranger's camp as I made my way down towards Stella Lake. I wanted to take a break and get a quick swim in the ice-cold, snow-fed water. I was stiff after spending the whole night crouched, fondling my 1911. I made it to the lake by noon, dropped my pack on the rocky shore, and set my clothes inside it. I brought swim trunks for this exact reason, and I gasped as I settled into the gently lapping, frosty waves. I saw a party of hikers on the opposite shore and gave a friendly wave. It made me feel safer, knowing that it wasn't just me and the freak I'd seen earlier. I swam a few laps until I began to shiver uncontrollably. I waded back to the shore where I had left my belongings. I grabbed the towel I set out and dried off. It was just after 1 p.m., so if I left now, I could make it to Spring Creek, where I planned to stay the rest of the trip. I opened my backpack and immediately noticed the absence of the clothes I had just put in. I dug through the pack frantically, laying every article out in a line on the ground. Everything else was exactly as it should be. I was especially relieved to find my gun, but my dirty laundry was gone. In the few minutes I spent in the lake, someone grabbed my shirt, pants, and underwear and ran off into the forest without me noticing, and I bet I know exactly who did it. The stranger from earlier must have followed me. Whatever reason he came to my tent, stole my clothes, I didn't want to know. At this point, I changed my plans completely. I'd work my way back towards the trailhead I had parked at. I'd cut around the base of Buck Mountain through the woods. There was a community trail there, not on any maps, but well-worn. I knew that it meant spending one more night in the park since it was a steep hike, but it was the most direct route back. I threw on my extra change of clothes and started a double-time pace up the gentle rocky slope into the forest. The whole time I was frantically looking at all sides of the trail. Every rustle in a bush, the chirp of a bird, or the knock of a falling acorn made me nearly break my neck as I whipped around. The sun set once again as I was deep in the trees along the side of the mountain. The evening sun no longer seemed beautiful, the pink and orange light casting long, twisting shadows that made me even more jumpy. I made camp hastily. I'd take a quick nap and get moving at first light. It may seem strange considering the situation, but trying to navigate at night in the forest is a death sentence, and I didn't want to get lost, especially if he was following me. I sat, quivering on my bedroll, waiting for the sound of footsteps to throw me into a full-on panic. Eventually, despite my anxiety, I drifted into an uneasy slumber. As the sun rose and dappled light fell on my face, I slowly felt my consciousness return before I staggered upright. The tent, swaying gently against the wind, was in tatters. Hundreds of small, jagged holes covered the blue synthetic surface, and one, a much larger one, was torn away right at the foot of my makeshift bed. That had been where I left my pack and my boots. Both of these items were gone now without a trace. As I looked closer, I gasped as I saw that each of the holes perfectly matched the shape of a set of human teeth. I let out a choked, desperate cry as I abandoned my shelter and ran into the woods towards the trail. My feet were torn into by small rocks, thorns, and roots with each step. I barely noticed the pain as I sprinted, flight response taking over entirely. The park ranger I ran into must have thought I'd lost it, the way he looked at me with pitying eyes. I hopped his truck, and he was kind enough to take me back to where I'd parked. I told him everything that had happened, words tumbling out in a jumbled mess. As I got out, he called me back for a second. Based on everything that happened, can you give me your contact info so we can follow up if you want to press any charges? The ranger said, his eyes friendly. I agreed, but somehow I doubted he would follow up on the mad ravings of a shoeless hiker. I drove back to the town outside of the park in a daze. My wallet, fortunately, had been in my pocket the whole trip, and the bread and breakfast had some vacancy. I fell back on the bed in my new room and sobbed. It wasn't just the fear of being hunted, nor the disappointment of a ruined vacation, but a sense of relief that overwhelmed me. I spent the rest of the day sightseeing in White Pine County. It's a cute area, with some historic buildings and rustic casinos. By the time I came back to my motel room, I'd almost forgotten about my horrifying experience. I went to sleep, but not before triple-checking that the door was locked and dead-bolted. I tried to get comfortable on the stiff mattress, but the same feeling of being watched kept me awake. I rolled onto my side and tried to screw my eyes shut and force myself to rest. Suddenly, after about 10 minutes in this position, something happened that made my heart stop. The bed depressed slightly as someone sat down on it, and I could hear something sliding across the sheets. A moist, clammy hand started to stroke my hair gently, the same way you'd gently pet a kitten. I could hear him breathing, a harsh, ragged sound. I bit my tongue and tried to play possum, as the thin, bony fingers began to pluck hairs one by one from my scalp. Tears streamed down my face, from the pain as he began pulling at clumps of it, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I almost wrenched my arm away when I felt his other hand reaching down and grabbing my own. The hand held mine gently. It seemed almost loving. Without warning, the calloused, rough fingers grabbed my thumb and swiftly yanked off the nail. I screamed involuntarily and fell off the bed in a heap. I could hear the sickening sound of teeth crunching and a soft, childlike giggle coming from my bed. I ran out the door and jumped in my car parked outside. I drove all that night and most of the next day until I made it home. I still imagined that hideous, emaciated man following me. The fear kept me awake all the way home. After I parked in my driveway, I was briefly terrified by the sudden buzz of my phone. I answered it, hearing the voice of the ranger on the other end. "Hey, we went down to the ridge where you camped, found 2 tents down there, but nobody around," he said, his voice making it clear he was holding something back. 2 tents? I asked, voice trembling. Yeah, 1 blue and 1 green, both torn to ribbons. I felt dizzy with fear, knowing that the other tent must be mine. He must have taken it, set it all up again. But why? "We found your pack," the ranger continued quietly. "We can arrange to have it sent to you." I thanked him profusely for his help and hung up. It's been 3 months since this terrible nightmare, and I still haven't gotten a good night's sleep. Worst of all, I still find that sporadically, I'll lose random belongings. A sock here and there, a pencil I set down a few minutes earlier, and it's driving me mad. I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe being alone again, but I know for sure I'm not going camping ever again. My parents disappear every October 31st. I don't mean they'd leave for a party or a night out. No, they'd vanish, gone without a trace by sunset, leaving me alone in the house. I'd search for them, call their names, but they were always gone, like they'd never existed. It wasn't something we ever talked about. The next morning, they'd be back, acting as if nothing had happened, like it was just another night. But it wasn't. I knew that. I learned that the hard way. It all started when I was 6 years old. I remember that first Halloween like it was yesterday. I was dressed as a witch, excited to go trick-or-treating. But just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed the house felt different. Cold, quiet, too quiet. I ran through the halls, calling for my mom and dad, but no one answered. Panic set in. I thought maybe they were hiding, playing a prank. But after what felt like hours of searching, I realized they were gone. The front door was locked, the windows were shut, and I was completely alone. That's when I found the first note. It was on the kitchen table, written in my mom's familiar handwriting. It simply said, "Rule 1, stay in your room. Do not come out until sunrise. Whatever you hear, ignore it." I didn't understand then. I was scared, confused, and alone. I didn't want to stay in my room. I wanted to find my parents. But something about the note made me follow the instructions. I took a flashlight and a pillow, locked myself in my room, and crawled under the covers. I thought maybe it was some kind of weird game. I wasn't sure. That night, I didn't sleep much. The house creaked and groaned more than usual. I heard strange noises, soft scratching at my door, footsteps in the hallway, whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I told myself it was the wind or my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was in the house with me. The next morning, when I opened my door, my parents were back. They were sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. I asked them where they'd gone, what had happened, but they just smiled and said, "I must have had a bad dream." That was the beginning. Every Halloween after that was the same. My parents would disappear just before nightfall, leaving me alone with a note. Each year, the instructions got a little more specific, a little more ominous. By the time I was 8, the notes included things like, "Rule 2, don't look out the windows," and Rule 3, "Don't respond if someone calls your name." And the noises, they got worse. One year when I was 9, the sounds outside my room became unbearable. There were knocks on the door, not gentle but loud, insistent pounding. I pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, but I couldn't block it out. The voice on the other side was familiar. My mother's voice, calling my name. "Ellie, it's okay, you can come out now." She sounded so calm, so normal. For a second I almost believed it was really her. But the rule had been clear. Do not open the door, no matter what you hear. So I didn't. I stayed under the covers, trembling, until the knocking stopped. I never told my parents about the voice, and they never asked. The years passed, and the game continued. It became a twisted Halloween tradition. While other kids dressed up and collected candy, I stayed locked in my room, listening to the house come alive with things I couldn't see. I became used to the notes, the strange noises, and the feeling of being watched. It was all part of the game, my own haunted ritual. But when I turned 13, everything changed. That year, the note was different. I found it on my bed just as the sun was setting, but instead of the usual instructions, it said, "Rule 4, there's something new in the house tonight. Be careful." I didn't know what that meant, but the moment I read it, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something new? What did that mean? I locked my door as usual and tried to settle in for the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The noises started earlier than usual. At first, it was the familiar creaks and footsteps. I'd gotten used to those, but then there was something else, breathing. I could hear it, low and heavy, just outside my door. It wasn't human. It was too slow, too deep. I pressed myself against the headboard, clutching my flashlight like a weapon, even though I knew it wouldn't help. The breathing moved away after a while, but then came the scratching. It wasn't at my door this time. It was coming from inside my room. I whipped the flashlight around, scanning the walls, the ceiling, but there was nothing. The scratching grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was coming from beneath my bed. My heart pounded in my chest, my throat dry with fear. I didn't dare look under the bed. I was too scared of what I might find. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, childlike giggle. The sound of it froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't me. It wasn't my parents. Something was in the room with me. I backed up against the wall, holding the flashlight out in front of me like it could protect me from whatever was there. The giggling continued, soft and mocking. I whispered to myself, "It's not real. It's just a game." But I didn't believe it anymore. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door. The whole room seemed to shake with the force of it. I dropped the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. The breathing was back, but this time it was right outside my door. Bang! Another hit. The door shuddered. Bang! The lock rattled. Whatever was out there was trying to get in. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The banging grew more violent, each hit sounding like the door was about to give in. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Pure, deafening silence. I held my breath, waiting, listening for any sign of movement. Then the voice returned, soft and sweet like honey. "Ellie, it's okay. You can come out now." It was my mother's voice again, but this time I knew it wasn't her. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen in fear, praying for the night to end. The voice called out again, more insistent this time. "Ellie, don't be scared. It's just a game." My hands were trembling, and I could barely hold on to the flashlight. The voice kept calling, but I stayed silent. I knew the rules. I knew I couldn't open the door. But then something strange happened. The door, it began to unlock. I heard the soft click of the lock turning, and the handle slowly twisted. "No," I whispered, pressing myself further against the wall, willing the door to stay shut. But it was too late. The door creaked open, just a crack, but enough for me to see a shadow in the hallway, something tall and thin, its limbs too long, its fingers clawed. It wasn't my mother. The creature stood in the doorway, unmoving, watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I might pass out. And then, just as it stepped forward, the first rays of sunlight crept through the window. The creature recoiled, hissing like an animal, and within seconds, it was gone. The door slammed shut, and the house was quiet again. I didn't leave my room until the sun was fully up. When I finally opened the door, the house was just as it had been the night before, silent, empty, as if nothing had happened. My parents were back, sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee like they always did. I stumbled in, shaken and pale, and told them everything. The creature, the scratching, the voice that wasn't my mother's. They just looked at me, exchanged glances, and then my dad laughed softly. "You must have had a bad dream," he said, shaking his head. "Nothing like that happened, Ellie. It was just your imagination." My mom smiled that same strange smile and added, "You're safe now. It's over." But I knew better. I knew it wasn't just a dream. The fear, the things I'd heard and seen, they were real. They had to be. My parents didn't believe me. They never did. And that was the most terrifying part. Now, as an adult with children of my own, I know the truth. Whatever haunted me in that house, whatever played that sick game, it's still out there, waiting. And it's hungry. I fear for the lives of my children. I'll never let them go through what I went through. I'll protect them at all costs, even if it means never celebrating Halloween, never letting the night touch them the way it touched me. Because I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before the game starts again. Halloween is coming.